It will turn into a beautiful princess. Before World War II, in most countries in Europe, the Jews were completely integrated into societies, whether we are talking about Germany or Poland or other countries. And they had all different types of jobs, whether they were government jobs or legal jobs or teachers, artists, and so on. They were professors at various universities and so on. And my father was a mechanical and an electrical engineer. He worked for Siemens in Germany. And in 1933, there were two engineers at Siemens who were working in his department, and it was suggested to them that they leave the company. It was just the beginning of roughly 2,000 different rules and regulations that had been issued against the Jews. And my father agreed. The other engineer did not agree. He said, "I'm staying." And they nearly killed him. They beat him up, and obviously he had to leave. So in 1933, my father lost his job, and we were wondering, he was wondering, I was 5 years old, I wasn't wondering where he would go. During World War I, my father had been an officer in the Austro-Hungarian army, and he served in Yugoslavia, actually in Croatia and in Serbia. There was no Yugoslavia then. And he decided that's a good country to go to. And so we went to Croatia, and we emigrated from Berlin in 1933 to Zagreb, Yugoslavia. Zagreb is and was a beautiful, beautiful city. This is the Opera House in Zagreb. It had a lot of culture. It was a really beautiful town. That's a picture of my sister and myself. I used to be adorable. And this is a picture of myself when I was about 11 years old. I don't have any other pictures of myself because all the other pictures have been destroyed. In 1940, my father died. Until that time, I lived a wonderful life. I had lots of friends. I went to school. I had religious education. It was a very, very good, comfortable life. We went on vacations. In 1941, Hitler invaded Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia immediately broke apart into various parts. By that time, you couldn't escape any place anymore. That was it. That was the end. Because, as you can see, all the other countries surrounding Yugoslavia had been occupied by Germany. Yugoslavia had been made out of 6 different countries before in 1918. Countries that some of them hated each other's guts. They really hated it, and they had been fighting for centuries. And when Hitler came, these same hatreds erupted again, and the country fell apart. Croatia, the country where we lived, immediately became an ally of Germany. Slovenia was taken over. Serbia said, "We'll fight you." Bosnia said, "We'll fight you." And in Croatia, which was Catholic, as you can see, all the other countries, there were different religions. In Serbia was Serbian Orthodox. The Macedonia was Greek Orthodox. Bosnia was Muslim and quite a bit of Jewish. and Croatia was basically Roman Catholic. And so on a religious basis and on a historical basis, they were fighting each other. Croatia became an independent kingdom, and the leader of that kingdom was Dr. Ante Pavelić. Dr. Pavelić was a fascist of the worst kind, and he immediately forced us to wear yellow stars. There was a letter Ž on it, which stands for Židov, and we also had to have the star on our backs. The old Jewish passports were stamped with a big J, or if you were a German citizen like my mother and my sister and myself were, and we also got a new middle name. Women got a middle name of Sarah, and men got a new middle name of Israel. They started immediately a concentration camp called Jasenovac. And approximately 200,000 people had been murdered in Jasenovac. There were 7 extermination camps that the Nazis had. 6 of them were in Poland, and the 7th was in Croatia. And what they did is they either starved people to death or they cut their throats. I've been looking desperately for pictures of the Ustaše, of the Croat soldiers, where they didn't hold the cut-off head, because that's what all the pictures showed. This is the only picture I could find. And then one day I was in a school, and I looked at the big enlargement, and I saw that even in this picture somebody is holding a knife. This is the type of knife that they used in the camps, and they had competitions who can cut the most throats. And one man actually won it by cutting 1,630 throats. There were soldiers all over the streets, everywhere. And my mother decided to hide me. I didn't know the people, and frankly speaking, I knew nothing about Nazis. I knew nothing about concentration camps. I knew nothing about all the atrocities. Now, you, being an intelligent audience, must ask yourself, hey, jerk, how come you didn't know anything? You lived in all of this. My parents were typical Victorians. They were born in the 1880s, 1890s, and they firmly believed that children are to be seen and not heard. And therefore there was absolutely no discussion whatsoever of what was happening. I didn't know why we left Germany. I didn't know what a concentration camp was. I didn't know anything. The only thing I knew about Germany was Hitler, Goering, and Goebbels were a whole slew of jokes. That's all. They were always joking, telling these jokes about people, about Hitler with a little bit of dirt under his nose and stuff like that. But beyond that, I knew absolutely nothing. We had frequently in Yugoslavia visitors from Germany who had escaped. We had people from Czechoslovakia who had escaped, from Austria, and whenever they came, they always got together with my parents, and the children were sent out of the room. So I knew absolutely nothing about it. Well, in 1941 or so, middle of 1941, my mother placed me first with one family, people I've never known, and a short time later she placed me with another couple, husband and wife, people I've never seen before, and they were developing films for the resistance movement. And I thought for a while this was very interesting. I went out on the street, but then people started pushing me because I had the yellow star on the back. And whenever there was a soldier on the sidewalk, you had to step into the gutter wearing a Jewish star. You couldn't be on the same sidewalk with a soldier. And then my friends started to disappear. I called them up and nobody answered the phone. Sometimes a strange voice answered. And I kept going less and less on out on the streets. I didn't wear any shoes in the apartment. This was an apartment building. People didn't live in houses, basically, except way out in the suburbs. I couldn't go near the window. I couldn't look out on the street because people from the street would see me. And I was very, very lonely. I was very lonely for about a year and a half there, not knowing these people. They were adults, and adults didn't talk to kids. I was 13, 14 years old. I was barely 15 when there was a knock at the door one morning, and I wasn't lonely anymore. There were 6 Gestapo men walked into the place, and they were looking for these people, and by sheer luck they found me too. But because I had a German passport, I was German, they arrested me. And I was lucky, because if the Ustasche would have arrested me, I wouldn't be sitting here. I would have had my throat cut somewhere, in Jasenovac or some other place. They took me down to their headquarters. I was 15 at that time. And I was a scrawny little kid. I was never big or fighter. And they beat the living daylights out of me. There was one Gestapo man, and he just hit me. He wanted to know about the people, about the film development and so on. And I was playing the big hero. I didn't realize that these people really could kill and would kill and did kill. I didn't know any of this stuff. I didn't have the slightest idea. I just played the hero. And eventually they sort of gave up on me. I still have a couple of scars. They locked me up in the basement in a cell. There must have been a coal cellar, so there was no bed or anything in it, concrete floor. And I was there for about 3 days. And after 3 days, they shipped me to a border town between Croatia and Slovenia. And I was locked up in a wooden cell that was filled with millions and millions of fleas. There were millions of fleas in there. Must have been a drunk tank or something like that. And from there, after 3 days, I was shipped to Graz, Austria, and I found myself in this particular building. This was then, and still is today, the police headquarters of the Graz police. I was up on the 3rd floor, locked up with 3 other kids. 2 kids had been arrested for burglary, and 1 kid had been arrested for murdering his mother. And I was the 4th criminal there. That's where I had my only revenge on the German government, because I infected the cell where I was and everybody around it with fleas. That's as far as my revenge came. The cell where we were, remember, this was not a prison, this was a holding cell for the police station before people were transferred. It was a very, very small cell. There was just enough room to sleep. This thing drives me nuts. the cell was in the back of the building, and this is the view of the prison yard. And I saw that prison yard. I saw it every day. I looked out from the window. One day I looked out and I saw my mother walking around in a circle in a gray prison uniform. My mother had been a nurse during World War I in the German army, and she saved several German soldiers from being gassed, and for that she was given the Iron Cross. And she believed that the Nazis would not do anything to her because she had a diploma which says the gratitude of the fatherland will be forever. That's the last time I ever saw her. She got killed somewhere in one of the camps. People ask me, do I know where she got killed? And I said, no, I'm not interested knowing. I've been through the camps, and to tell you the truth, I don't want to place her in my mind into any of these places where I was or places I knew about. I was there for 6 weeks in beautiful Graz when I was transferred to Vienna, the city of my dreams, and I spent the night in this particular shul. Actually, when I came there, it didn't look like that anymore. It looked like this. It was destroyed during the night of the broken glass. There was dirty, filthy water on the ground. There were spots of charred walls. The seats were all torn up. And I was locked up there overnight with maybe 100 people. And the next day, we went on a train and traveled for 2 days to Czechoslovakia. And we ended up in a place called Terezin, also known as Theresienstadt. Huge walls. Look at the size of the walls. And look at the shape of it. Actually, it wasn't a regular town. It wasn't a regular prison. What it was is, it was a fortress that had been built in 1780 and against the Prussians. But when planes were invented and tanks, fortresses lost their value completely. Didn't make any more sense. So the military moved out, the civilians moved in. About 2,600 civilians lived there. And when Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, he said, this is a perfect place for a concentration camp. And what he wanted to do was, not necessarily Hitler, somebody in his government, make an example, a sort of an exhibit camp, because the Swiss and the Swedish authorities have been griping that the Nazis are mistreating the Jews. So this was the exhibit camp. There were hundreds of camps throughout Europe. There were 7 extermination camps, 6 in Poland, 1 in Yugoslavia. And this is the way the town looked. Now, what they've done was they did a couple of things. Number one, they shipped German, Dutch, Austrian, and Czech intelligentsia to Terezin. They provided them with pencils and musical instruments, and the kids were living happily confined. There were, as I mentioned, there were 2,600 people living before the war. There were now 90,000 people living there. And every time there was an inspection, the food got improved, but maybe 10, 20, 30, 40,000 people, 50,000 people were sent to Auschwitz, to the gas chambers. The camp was emptied. 141,000 people had been shipped to Terezin, and 17,000 survived, just to give you an idea. It was, by the way, the only camp I was in that was strictly Jewish. There were no other people there. There were Jews from Holland, as I said, from Germany, from Austria and Czechoslovakia, and I think there were a few Italian Jews, I'm not quite sure. This is where we slept, this is where we washed ourselves, this is how they served the food out on the street. And this is how people arrived. And they actually didn't arrive like that until I was there, and I helped lay these railroad tracks. It was excruciatingly hard work. If somebody offers you a deal of laying railroad tracks, don't. It's no pleasure, and it's really, really hard work. This was the typical building in which we lived. I had quite a few jobs there. I made brooms, I made baskets, I also exterminated vermin. And how did we do that? We went into these buildings. You see, the Nazis were extremely fussy about vermin, about diseases, diseases that came from vermin. So they cut your hair, they did all these wonderful things because they were afraid that the disease will spread and you will have dead people, which did not prevent them from taking live people and putting them into gas chambers or standing them against walls and shooting them. What we did was we took cyclone gas, we taped up the windows, and which is cyanide gas, and then we opened the cans, we put on gas masks, we opened the cans, and then we spilled these pellets around the building, and then we ran out and closed the doors, came back the next day, put on gas masks, and swept out, aired the place and swept out that rats. The Nazis tried to use the cyclone gas on people, but it didn't work. Actually, it did work, but it didn't work fast enough. It took something like 20 minutes for people to die, and they were looking for something faster. So they used cyclone B gas, which is prussic acid, which is much more poisonous and which was much more efficient, to the point that they were able to gas and kill in Auschwitz at one point at the rate of 6,000 people a day. One day, I was there for about 11 months. They brought in a whole bunch of railroad cars, just like this. And we walked up these railroad cars, 100 people per car, and then they closed the doors. There were no seats, no nothing in these cars. And the windows were closed with barbed wires, and we went off. We traveled east. Didn't have the slightest idea where we were going to. We traveled about 3 days. By this time, a few people had actually died in the cars. And when we arrived, we were immediately greeted by a group of SS men. And if you look at, and also people in prison uniforms. If you look at these people, every single one of them has a heavy walking stick. And they were using these walking sticks on us. They were beating us over the heads, over the legs, wherever they could reach. The guy in the prison uniform, look how nicely it is tailored. He was actually a German criminal. He was a murderer who was sent to Auschwitz. And he and the SS men, there were many of these criminals there, were buddies. I mean, the guy killed somebody at one point, so boys will be boys. But basically, they were good, pure Aryans, not like these filthy, dirty Jewish doctors or Jewish scientists. Behind us, there was a gate, and next to us, there was electrically charged barbed wire. We didn't know where we were, and then they told us we were in Auschwitz II, or Birkenau. Auschwitz had actually 3 camps. Auschwitz I, which housed about 50,000 people, and they were all criminals. Auschwitz I was an overflow camp of the German prison system. Auschwitz II was an extermination camp. And when somebody says they were in Auschwitz, that meant Auschwitz II. And then there was a 3rd camp called Auschwitz III, which was actually a small factory. And there were not many people there. This is the way the Auschwitz Birkenau camp looked. People arrived at the railroad tracks, if you can see that. Oh. Let me see. These are the railroad tracks. This is the men's camp and the gypsy camp, and this is the women's camp. There were 2 women's camps, one next to the other. If you look at it, it was sort of a split in the middle. There were something like 6 men and gypsy camps, which are on the right-hand side. And on top you see 4 buildings, 2 to the left and 2 to the right. Those were the 4 gas chambers. Those were the places where people got killed. So what happened was people were walking from probably 90% at least, maybe even a higher percentage, of people were walking directly from the railroad tracks to one of these gas chambers, these crematorias. The property that they brought with them, and they brought a lot of property. Why did they bring a lot of property? Because everybody who was arrested was told that they are being resettled. So everybody brought with them bedding and silverware and jewelry and whatever they had, and food. All that stuff was put into the little barracks up on the top in the middle, the black area, that's called Canada. And that's where all the stuff went. It was sorted. When they arrived, they dropped it all at the railroad tracks. It was moved there by people who worked in Canada, who were a separate group of people. There were 2 types of workers there who actually had jobs. The rest of us never did very, very little. One group was working in the crematoria and the gas chambers, and the other was working in Canada. The one in the crematoria, they were working usually about 6 months or so, and then they were gassed. And they knew that. And I've been through lots of things, and I've seen a lot of things, but I cannot imagine knowing for sure that 2 months, 1 month from now I'll be dead. I knew when I came to the camp. They told us, hey, you'll be here maybe 6 months and you'll be gassed. When they told us that, when we arrived there, the other prisoners, we thought this is nonsense, you know, it was totally incomprehensible. First time in my life, in our lives, that we ever heard that. Because we had You know, I mean, it's a sort of a completely new concept. And it took us about 3 weeks, that long, 3 weeks before it sank in. Yeah, that's what's going to happen. Despite the fact that we saw people walking towards the gas chambers every single day, because there's just electrically charged barbed wire between us, and we saw the people arriving, going. We saw the chimneys spewing huge flames, and the camp being covered with the smell of burning flesh and burning hair every single day. But it still took us roughly 3 weeks. I was there in 1944. That was the time when the Hungarian Jews were brought to the camp. Every day, from morning to night, they were gassing and burning people. And of course, the Hungarian Jews, they didn't say anything, they didn't scream or cry, because they knew nothing about this whole thing. They were just walking there. Yes, we are being, we are being cleaned, we are going to the showers. However, there were gypsies there. One camp was nothing else but gypsies. They've been in the camp for 3 months, 6 months. They knew what is going to happen. They were the people who were screaming and crying, and whose cries we heard constantly. They were Jehovah's Witnesses. They had been there for a long time. They were screaming and crying, and sometimes people who had been Jews, who'd been in the camp for some length of time, they were taken there, and they were crying, but the Hungarian Jews didn't, because they didn't know what was going on. This is the way we looked. They cut all our hair, and they put us into these beautiful uniforms. Every couple of weeks or so, we had to strip, and they gave us new underwear. I have had many, many indignities and unpleasantness while I was in the camp. But the most humiliating experience I had in the camp, and don't try to even imagine it, and remember, we had diarrhea constantly from the food and so on. The most humiliating experience that I had, wearing underwear made out of talisin. I don't know if you can imagine it, and I'm not asking you to, but it's something that I will never ever forget. This is the way the women looked, also with their hair cut, and then we got a tattoo on our arms. The criminals didn't have tattoos, just the rest of us. Obviously, all the people who were sent to the gas chambers, they didn't get tattoos. And then we got a triangle on our uniform. And depending why you were in the camp, that's how the triangle was colored. So you had political prisoners wear red, gay people pink, Jehovah's Witnesses purple, gypsies and vagrants black, Jews yellow, thieves and robbers light green, and murderers dark green. And these thieves and murderers were supervising us. They were what they called their capos. They were the people who could kill us, do whatever they wanted to, and had full approval of the Nazis. This was a typical barrack where we slept. There were 3 levels in each bunk, and there were 6 people sleeping on each level. 6. So 18 people in one bunk bed. There was constantly diarrhea and urine dripping from one level to the other. Sometimes the top level would collapse and fall on the middle level, and the middle on the lower level, and kill the people on the lower level. This is a women's barrack after liberation. By this time, half the people were gone. There were only half the people there, and this is the way it looked. And this is a men's barrack after liberation, and this is also a men's barrack. There are only 3 people on each level. The man in the middle has the only 2 possessions that we had, a bowl and a spoon. And the bowl was filled in the morning with some brown water made out of acorns, and we got 2 ounces of bread made out of flour and sawdust. For lunch we got a soup made out of salt water and cut up dirty unwashed potatoes, sand and grit. And in the evening we got another bowl of soup, also with turnips or with dirty potatoes, and we got another piece of bread, and that was it. You were not permitted to carry anything into the camp. Sometimes people managed to smuggle in a gold watch, and then they tried to sell it to other prisoners. What these prisoners would have done with that watch, I have not the slightest idea. The going price for a gold Omega watch were 2 ounces of bread. Just to give you an idea of the value of food and how suddenly things of great value are meaningless. This is the toilet that we used. All of us had obviously the diarrhea, and it was apart from the gassing, it was the biggest killer in the camp. Because you got diarrhea, and after about 3 days you were dead. I got it once and I managed to survive it barely. But there was nothing you could do, because what little strength you had, was drained out of you. And this was the bench they used for us to punish us. Sometimes if we misbehaved, you put your feet in the 2 holes in the bottom, and you leaned over the bench, and one of the criminals held your arms and the other one beat you with a stick. I've seen people dying on this bench. These 3 good-looking guys are probably the 3 worst people in the world. Richard Baer and Rudolf Hess were the commander of Auschwitz, and they supervised the murder of over 1 million people. And Mengele, he selected people for the gas chamber, and he also experimented. He did all different types of experiments. Just as an aside, Mengele drowned in a swimming pool in 1979 in South America, in case if you are wondering if anything happened to him. He was amongst the 9,000 Nazis who had escaped to South America, and he was making a living as an abortionist there. This is the way the camp looked. 3 times a day we used to stand between the barracks and be counted. And if one person out of 6,000 was missing, we had to stand there and do exercises, push-ups, jumps, rolling, whatever else, and people died doing that. There was no way you could escape from the camp. There was electrically charged barbed wire, there were guard towers, there were German shepherds that had been trained to run after people with striped uniforms, and once they caught them, tear them apart. To the best of my knowledge, only 2 people ever successfully managed to escape from Auschwitz. Just 2 people. That's all. People were caught, and then the punishment was horrible. One man tried to escape. They caught him, they took a barrel and they hammered nails from the outside of the barrel into the barrel. They put the man in the barrel, they closed the barrel, and they rolled it down a hill. I had to watch once how 2 men were beaten to pulp, and I mean pulp. And I was forced to watch that because they tried to escape. Many people committed suicide, they just couldn't take the camp. And this was the crematoria, one of the 4 crematorias. And this was a gas chamber, and through this hole in the ceiling, the Cyclone B gas, the prussic acid gas, the pellets were dropped, and once the people were dead, then the Sonderkommando, which was a group of people who worked there for about 6 months, went in there and removed all the gold teeth and any other property that they had on them, and then they shoved the bodies into the crematoria, into the ovens. Barracks full of shoes and clothing, pots and pans, and empty suitcases. This is Dr. Mengele, Joseph Mengele. He was constantly in the camp where I was. He kept, for some reason, he spent a lot of time there. He was carrying a buckle which says, "God with us." I always wished the buckle would have said, "We with God." He was affectionately known as the Angel of Death. He came one day into the camp and took all the people in the camp and separated young boys, young men from the others. There were maybe a couple of thousand of us. And we had to strip and run past him. And as we were running past Dr. Mengele, he was standing there and telling jokes with other SS men. They were laughing, and sometimes he looked up and he did this or he did this. And when he was finished with all of us, there were maybe 300 people there. And we had to run past him again. And he continued with his joke session and this sort of a thing. And there were about 200 of us. We had to run again. And when he finished with it, there were 89 of us. And the 89 of us were told to put on our uniforms, and we went to a different camp. And the other 5,900 people in that camp were sent to the gas chamber over the next few days, next 5 days. They all died. This is what we saw. People ask me sometimes, what was the worst thing that ever happened to you in the camp? The worst thing that happened to me was never knowing from one day to the next whether I'm going to be alive. I was 16 years old at that time, and I never knew. By the way, of these 89 Jewish kids, 8 months later, when the war was over, only 40 of us were still alive. 40 out of 6,000. That's all. We were sent to another camp, and that had a penalty division there. And I played many times on these gallows. I was sitting on them with other fellows. It was the only place where we could sit in the yard. And these gallows were used. After a couple of months, I was sent to Auschwitz I. And I spent the next couple of months in Auschwitz I amongst German criminals, murderers, thieves, you name it. I mean, the scum of the world. In January 1945, all the criminals were put into German uniforms and sent to the German front, to the Russian front. And the rest of us were given a piece of bread, and we started on a death march. It was icy cold and snowing. It was just miserable. And we started walking. And we walked for an hour or two, and then we stopped. And those who couldn't get up were shot. And we continued, and we stopped, and people were shot. First night we slept in a stable. Second day things were very, very bad, because the food that the bread that they have given us, we've taken and we've tossed it away because it froze in our pockets. It was just a block of ice. The only water that we had was the snow and ice from the road. And we continued, and on the second day, people were crying and screaming, "Help me, help me." They were stripping themselves naked on the road because they couldn't carry the uniform, it was too heavy for them. And this was the temperature, must have been 20, 30 degrees below zero. It was unbelievably cold. And people just died. And if you tried to help somebody, you would have died too. This is one of the things that still bothers me to this day. Should I have helped or not? I know that I wouldn't have survived, because there's no way that I could have helped somebody else. I discussed this subject with some rabbis and even some Christian ministers, and pretty well the same. I got the same response, you know. It was my responsibility to save myself first. But despite of it, I still feel terrible to this day. On the third day, we were loaded into open railroad cars. And we traveled for 4 days from Poland to Austria. By this time, half the people were dead. The only thing we did was we could shove the people over the edge of the railroad car, and we had some room, but the floor was frozen. It was solid steel. We arrived in a place called Mauthausen. Mauthausen had been probably one of the worst camps that the Nazis had. It was specifically set up for prisoners of war, and particularly prisoners of war who misbehaved in prisoner of war camps. There were French prisoners of war, French Foreign Legion. There were Belgian prisoners of war from the Spanish Civil War. There were Yugoslav prisoners of war there. And these people had been worked to death. They had a quarry, and they were forced to carry 100-pound rocks up 186 steps. And then, when they were on the top, the Nazis called it parachute jumping without a parachute. They had to push each other off a cliff and die. They injected people with gasoline there. They stripped people naked in the winter and sprayed them with water. It was just a horror. We limped, dragged ourselves through this gate, and we came into this yard. And then we were taken into showers, and we just collapsed, screaming with pain, because all of us were frostbitten. It was the most excruciating pain you can imagine. After 3 days, my feet started to rot. There was a Serbian prisoner of war there who heard me curse in Croat, and because I couldn't speak, I was in such pain. And he cut off my toes on one foot without any anesthesia, and part of the toes on the other foot, and that's how he saved my life. And then things got worse, because we were surrounded on one side by American forces and on the other side by Russian forces. There was no food there. We were starving. We were getting a tablespoon of moldy bread a day. I slept next to a dead man for 3 days just to get his ration. And then on the 5th of May, now remember that's 2 days before the end of the war, 5th of May, I was liberated by American troops, and this is what they found. And this is the way we looked. I weighed 64 pounds when I was liberated, and I was 17 years old. And then the American troops gave us military rations. It's the only rations that they had, only food that they had. And about 20,000 people died eating that food.
Right.
Because there were 2,000–3,000 calories,
Right.
and we were living on maybe 100 calories a day or so. After 3 weeks or so, I got this certificate, which I donated to the Holocaust Museum here, and I hitchhiked back home to Yugoslavia. And when I came back, I found nothing. I found the country, but I found destruction, and I found communism. And things were just as bad as under the Nazis. People were arrested, people were shot, people were hanged, people were beaten up. Only now different people, but still, you never knew who, what, where, and how. I went to these were the soldiers, and this is my certificate before I left, 2 years after I left the country. And 2 years after I arrived. I didn't look like that when I arrived, I can assure you. I had no hair, I was skinny and so on. Yet, there were Jews there. There were. Zagreb had at one point, a large Jewish community. And when I came back, there was a Jewish community center there. And there were Jews there. And we had Friday night services. We celebrated the Jewish holidays. There was a tremendous feeling of Jewish togetherness. Now, these were all different types of Jews, from the ultra-Orthodox, if you will, through Jews who went once a year to shul, if that often. But it didn't matter, because nobody asked you what degree of Jew are you or what. You were a Jew. You were a fellow sufferer, a fellow human being, a Jew. And we were delighted that you are alive, that you survived this hell, because very, very, very few people actually did. I had before the war 13 Jewish friends, 13 kids with whom I went to school. When I came back, they were all dead. All. Every single one of them. I stayed in Yugoslavia for 2 years, and then I went to England. And when I came to England, I had a little problem. I was 19 years old, totally uneducated. I went to school until the ripe old age of 13, and I couldn't speak English, and I didn't have any skills. The only skills I had was stealing bread and swearing in 6 different languages. There is very, very little demand for these skills, so I really couldn't make a living out of it. So I started working as a laborer, and then I worked as a machine tool fitter and then a tool and die maker. In England, I joined the Jewish youth organization Habonim. In Yugoslavia, before the war, I belonged to Hashomer Hatzair. And I met a great number of beautiful Jewish kids, my age kids. We were adults, people I'm still very, very close with today. And then I met my wife. Actually, she wasn't my wife then. She was a 16-year-old girl, and a couple of months later she was 17, who had come to England on the Kindertransport. A man called Nicholas Winton, an Englishman, an English stockbroker, went to Czechoslovakia, and he forged documents like this document here, and he saved 669 children. And this is my wife as a little child. And here she is with Nicholas Winton, the man who saved her life many, many years later, maybe 50 years later or so, 60 years later. We married. We've been married 57 years. I've known her 61. She's still the love of my life. She was the first girlfriend that I had. I haven't had any other girlfriends because I lost all my teenage years. And I met her, and I've never regretted it. I came to the States. I worked in various offices. I went to college at night. I got a college degree. I worked as an industrial engineer for major corporations. Grand Union, Hill Supermarkets, was in charge of systems, methods, controls. And that's it, folks. That's all. Thank you for listening. And just as a final note, I'd like to say one thing. As a Jew, I and the rest of them all went through hell, but we survived. We Jews have the capability of surviving and working hard at it. And the Holocaust, instead of weakening us, I think made us as a Jewish people, a stronger people. And the result is the state of Israel. Thank you very much. Thank you.
For sure.